rain hammered against the steel hull of the M4 Sherman as Sergeant Thomas Brennan peered through the narrow vision slit into the gray dawn of April 1st, 1945. Somewhere in the volcanic ridges ahead, 30,000 Japanese soldiers waited in a labyrinth of caves and tunnels that had taken months to construct. Brennan had seen combat in the Philippines, had watched good men die in jungles and rice paddies, but nothing had prepared him for what Okinawa would demand. Within hours, his tank battalion would roll into a nightmare that would redefine armored warfare in the Pacific. What followed would shatter Japanese defensive doctrine and prove that even the most fanatical resistance could be crushed beneath American steel and firepower. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The island of Okinawa represented everything the Japanese Empire was willing to sacrifice to prevent an American invasion of the home islands. Stretching 60 miles long and ranging from 2 to 18 miles wide, this rugged coral and volcanic rock fortress sat just 340 miles from mainland Japan. For Japanese military planners, Okinawa was not merely another island to be defended. It was the final barrier, the last chance to inflict such catastrophic casualties on American forces that the United States might reconsider its demand for unconditional surrender. General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded the Japanese 32nd Army, a force that had transformed Okinawa's southern highlands into perhaps the most formidable defensive position in military history. Unlike previous island campaigns, where Japanese commanders had ordered suicidal banzai charges and contested beach landings, Ushijima had studied American tactics with cold precision. He understood that charging into American machine guns and artillery accomplished nothing except filling graves. His strategy would be different, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. The Japanese had spent over 6 months converting Okinawa's natural cave systems into an interconnected fortress. Engineers had carved gun positions into solid rock, positioned artillery in caves that could fire and then be sealed shut before American counter-battery fire could locate them. Supply tunnels connected positions miles apart, allowing Japanese troops to disappear from one sector and emerge in another. Command bunkers sat 30 feet underground, protected by layers of coral rock that could withstand direct hits from naval bombardment. Every ridge, every hill, every ravine had been surveyed and registered for artillery fire. The Japanese knew exactly where American forces would have to advance, and they had prepared killing zones with mathematical precision. Most critically for what was to come, Ushijima's forces had been equipped with more anti-tank weapons than any previous Japanese defensive position in the Pacific War. 47mm anti-tank guns were positioned in caves with perfect fields of fire across the narrow valleys and ridgelines that American armor would have to traverse. Larger 70mm and even a handful of captured British and Chinese artillery pieces had been incorporated into the defensive network. Japanese engineers had planted thousands of mines across every conceivable approach route. Tank traps had been dug at key choke points, reinforced with logs and concrete to channel American armor into prepared killing zones. The Japanese had learned bitter lessons from previous campaigns. At Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, American armor had proven devastatingly effective once it got ashore and into action. Japanese planners had watched their defensive positions crumble under the combined assault of American tanks working with infantry and artillery. But those islands had offered limited opportunities for defense in depth. Okinawa was different. The southern highlands offered ridge after ridge of defensible terrain, valleys that funneled attackers into narrow corridors, and escarpments that rose like castle walls across the American axis of advance. The Japanese assessment of American armor capabilities was both accurate and dangerously incomplete. They understood that the M4 Sherman, medium tank, which formed the backbone of American armored forces, was vulnerable to their anti-tank guns at close range. Intelligence reports correctly noted that the Sherman's armor could be penetrated by 47mm guns at distances under 500 yards. Japanese tank crews who had survived encounters with American armor in the Philippines reported that the Sherman could be stopped with proper tactics and positioning. What the Japanese military failed to fully appreciate was the sheer scale of American armored deployment and the evolution of tactics that had occurred over 3 years of Pacific combat. By early 1945, American commanders had refined a devastating combined arms doctrine that integrated armor, infantry, artillery, and air support into a system that could crack even the strongest defensive positions. More importantly, American industrial production meant that losses which would cripple Japanese forces were merely temporary setbacks that could be made good within days. The American invasion force assembling off Okinawa represented the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded over 1,300 ships, carrying more than 180,000 troops for the initial assault. The landing force included the 10th Army under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., comprising both the 24th Corps and the 3rd Amphibious Corps. Supporting this massive ground force were hundreds of tanks from multiple battalions, including the 711th, 713th, and 763rd Tank Battalions, along with Marine Corps tank units equipped with the latest variants of American armor. The Sherman tanks rolling off landing craft on April 1st represented 3 years of combat evolution and industrial refinement. The basic M4 design, first deployed in 1942, had been continuously improved based on after-action reports from every theater of war.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
War. By 1945, the Shermans heading to Okinawa included multiple variants, each optimized for specific roles. The M4A3 model, powered by a Ford GAA V8 engine producing 500 horsepower, had become the standard for Pacific operations. Its welded hull construction was more resistant to mine damage than earlier riveted designs. Improved suspension and wider tracks helped with mobility in the muddy, churned terrain that characterized Pacific battlefields. More critically, American tanks now carried weapons that could demolish fortified positions. While the standard 75mm gun remained effective against most targets, many Shermans had been upgunned with 76mm high-velocity cannons that could penetrate heavier armor and deliver more devastating high-explosive shells. Some battalions included M4A3E2 assault tanks, nicknamed jumbos, which carried additional armor plating that made them nearly invulnerable to Japanese anti-tank guns from the front. Most significant for the Okinawa campaign were the flame-throwing variants, the M4A3R3 Zippo and the Marine Corps POA CWS 75H1, which could project streams of burning napalm up to 150 yards, turning Japanese cave positions into crematoriums. The initial landings on April 1st, Easter Sunday, proceeded with an ease that surprised American commanders. Japanese forces offered minimal resistance on the beaches, allowing thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles to pour ashore throughout the day. By nightfall, more than 60,000 American troops occupied beachheads stretching across 8 miles of Okinawa's western coast. Tank battalions moved inland cautiously, their commanders experienced enough to know that easy landings often preceded savage fighting. For 3 days, American forces advanced across northern and central Okinawa against light opposition. Marine divisions pushed north into the island's mountainous spine, while Army units turned south toward the real objective, the heavily defended ridgelines where General Ushijima waited. Tank units supported infantry advances, blasting suspected positions and providing mobile firepower that could suppress any resistance. The ease of the advance created a false sense of confidence among some American units. That illusion was about to be shattered with extreme violence. On April 4th, lead elements of the 96th Infantry Division advanced toward a ridge system that would become known as Cactus Ridge. Supporting them were Shermans from the 763rd Tank Battalion, veterans of fighting in the Philippines who understood jungle and mountain warfare. As the tanks crested a rise and began moving down a narrow valley, Japanese observers in the ridges above triggered a carefully orchestrated ambush.
47mm guns opened fire from concealed positions on 3 sides. The lead Sherman erupted in flames as an armor-piercing round penetrated its side armor and ignited ammunition. A second tank threw a track when it hit a buried naval mine. Within minutes, the valley floor became a killing zone as Japanese gunners systematically engaged every American vehicle they could see. The tank crews fought back with everything they had. Sherman commanders traversed their turrets, searching desperately for the muzzle flashes that would reveal enemy positions. High explosive rounds slammed into the ridge faces, but the Japanese guns were positioned in caves with firing ports barely large enough to accommodate their barrels. After firing, Japanese crews would roll their guns back into the caves and seal the entrances with camouflage or movable barriers. American tankers found themselves shooting at ghosts, expending ammunition against positions that would fall silent after a few shots and then reappear elsewhere. The infantry supporting the tanks fared even worse. Japanese machine gunners positioned in mutually supporting positions opened fire the moment American troops moved into the open. Mortar rounds began falling with devastating accuracy, the Japanese forward observers having pre-registered every meter of ground for indirect fire. American casualties mounted rapidly as units tried to withdraw from the killing zone. The tanks that could still move backed up under fire, their crews knowing that exposing their thinner rear armor invited catastrophic hits. By the time the Americans pulled back to their start line, 4 tanks had been destroyed and 3 others damaged. Casualties among the infantry approached 20%. The Battle of Okinawa had truly begun. Over the following days, American commanders came to understand the magnitude of the challenge facing them. The entire southern third of Okinawa had been transformed into a defender's paradise. The terrain consisted of a series of coral and limestone ridges running roughly east to west across the island, creating natural defensive barriers. Between the ridges lay narrow valleys, most flooded by spring rains that turned them into impassable mud. The ridges themselves rose sharply, often with sheer faces 30 to 60 feet high. Japanese engineers had carved firing positions into these escarpments, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. Some positions were connected by tunnels that ran through the ridge spines, allowing Japanese troops to shift positions without exposing themselves to American fire. Tank operations in this terrain seemed nearly impossible. The narrow valleys channeled armor into predictable routes where Japanese anti-tank gunners could engage at point-blank range. The muddy ground reduced mobility to a crawl, making tanks easy targets. The steep ridges were impassable to armor, forcing American tanks to operate in the valleys, while Japanese guns fired down from elevated positions. Early attempts to simply bowl through the defenses resulted in shocking losses. On April 9th, a coordinated attack by the 27th Infantry Division, supported by tanks from the 711th Tank Battalion, attempted to break through Japanese lines near Kakazu Ridge. Of the 30 tanks that went forward, 27 were hit by anti-tank fire or disabled
by mines. The attack collapsed in confusion as infantry units found themselves pinned down without armored support. American commanders faced a terrible dilemma. Standard doctrine called for armor to support infantry advances, providing mobile firepower and protection. But the terrain and Japanese defensive positions made conventional tank infantry cooperation nearly suicidal. Sending tanks forward without adequate infantry support invited ambush by Japanese infiltration teams armed with magnetic mines and satchel charges. But keeping tanks in reserve meant infantry would face the full weight of Japanese defensive fire without the suppressive firepower that armor could provide. The solution emerged gradually through trial, error, and the hard-won experience of combat veterans. Tank battalion commanders began developing new tactics specifically designed for Okinawa's unique challenges. Rather than attempting to charge through Japanese defenses, American armor would be employed methodically, working in close cooperation with infantry and engineers to systematically reduce each defensive position before advancing further. The key was patience, overwhelming firepower, and accepting that progress would be measured in yards rather than miles.
Central to these new tactics was the recognition that Japanese cave positions, while formidable, had critical vulnerabilities. The caves provided excellent protection from artillery and aerial bombardment, but they were essentially fixed positions with limited fields of fire. Once identified, they could be isolated and systematically destroyed. The challenge was getting close enough to engage them effectively without being destroyed in the process. American planners realized that this required a fundamentally different approach to armored warfare than anything previously attempted in the Pacific. Engineers became as important as the tanks themselves. Combat engineer battalions worked around the clock to create routes through the minefields and improved roads that could handle the weight of armor in muddy conditions. They built bypass routes around destroyed tanks that blocked narrow defiles. They constructed ramps and fills that allowed armor to reach positions where they could fire directly into Japanese cave mouths. Bulldozer tanks, Shermans with the turrets removed and bulldozer blades fitted, proved invaluable for creating firing positions and clearing obstacles under fire. Artillery coordination reached new levels of sophistication. Forward observers worked directly with tank platoons, calling in massive concentrations of fire to suppress Japanese positions before armor moved forward. The Americans discovered that while Japanese troops could survive naval gunfire and aerial bombing in their deep bunkers, they still had to emerge to man their weapons when attacks developed. Careful timing of artillery strikes could catch Japanese troops in the open or suppress their fire during critical moments when American tanks were most vulnerable. Most revolutionary was the systematic employment of flame-throwing tanks. The Japanese defensive positions that were nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons had one critical weakness: they required ventilation. Caves and bunkers needed air circulation or their defenders would suffocate, especially after using firearms, which filled enclosed spaces with smoke. American tankers discovered that directing streams of burning napalm into cave mouths created conditions that were absolutely unsurvivable. The flames consumed oxygen, filled chambers with toxic smoke, and created temperatures that could reach thousands of degrees. Japanese troops faced a terrible choice: remain in positions that had become ovens or emerge into American machine gun fire. Either way, the result was the same. The first large-scale application of these refined tactics came in mid-April during the assault on Kakuzu Ridge, a position that had repulsed multiple American attacks. Tank platoons from the 763rd Battalion worked with flamethrower tanks and infantry from the 96th Division in a carefully choreographed assault. Artillery plastered the ridge with white phosphorus shells, marking cave positions and forcing Japanese troops to take cover. As the barrage lifted, Shermans advanced to prearranged firing positions where engineers had created level platforms. From these positions, the tanks could fire directly into identified cave mouths with high explosive and white phosphorus rounds. Behind this initial barrage, the flame tanks moved forward, their crews knowing they were the most critical element of the assault. Japanese troops emerged from their positions to engage the approaching armor with everything they had. Anti-tank guns fired from camouflaged positions. Small arms fire rattled off the Sherman's armor, and soldiers with satchel charges attempted to close with the American vehicles. But the supporting infantry, moving behind the tanks and using the armor as mobile cover, cut down Japanese troops before they could reach the vehicles. The regular Shermans traversed their turrets methodically, engaging any position that revealed itself by firing. Then the flame tanks went to work. The POA CWS 75H1 variant, developed specifically for Pacific operations, carried 290 gallons of napalm mixture and could fire up to 81-second bursts. The tank commander of the lead flame tank, Sergeant Robert Mackenzie, positioned his vehicle within 50 yards of the largest cave mouth identified by intelligence. Through his periscope, he could see Japanese soldiers moving in the shadows just inside the entrance. Mackenzie gave the command, and his gunner triggered the flame projector. A stream of burning gel shot forward, splashing into the cave mouth and spreading across the walls and floor. The screams that followed were audible even inside the sealed tank.
Japanese troops staggered from the cave entrance, their uniforms ablaze, and were cut down by American infantry. The cave position, which had withstood days of bombardment, had been neutralized in seconds. This scene repeated across Kakuzu Ridge throughout the day. One cave after another fell to the systematic assault of American armor and infantry, working in perfect coordination. By nightfall, positions that seemed impregnable
Morning were smoldering ruins filled with Japanese dead. The cost to American forces had been remarkably light compared to previous attacks. No tanks had been destroyed, though several bore the scars of anti-tank hits that had been deflected by their armor or had struck at angles that prevented penetration. Infantry casualties, while still significant, were a fraction of what earlier frontal assaults had produced. The success at Kakuzu Ridge established the template for American operations for the remainder of the Okinawa campaign. Tank battalions were reorganized into combined arms teams that operated with the same infantry units repeatedly, building the trust and communication essential for close combat. Each tank platoon was paired with engineer squads who could address obstacles and create firing positions. Flamethrower tanks, initially viewed as specialized equipment of limited utility, became the most requested asset among infantry commanders. Their psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immense. Soldiers who could endure artillery barrages and aerial attacks broke and ran when faced with the approaching flame tanks. Japanese commanders recognized the threat and attempted to adapt their tactics. Anti-tank gun crews were ordered to prioritize flamethrower tanks, which were easily identified by their distinctive appearance and the absence of a main gun. Japanese infantry teams were organized specifically to hunt American armor, equipped with magnetic mines, pole charges, and suicide demolition vests. General Ushijima issued orders emphasizing that stopping American tanks was the highest priority for his defenders. Every available anti-tank weapon was to be employed without hesitation. Japanese artillerymen were instructed to fire on American armor even if it meant revealing their positions to counter battery fire. These measures achieved some success. American tank losses increased as Japanese defenders concentrated their efforts on armor. On April 19th, a platoon of Shermans from the 711th Battalion was caught in a carefully prepared ambush near Maeda Escarpment. Japanese troops had allowed the tanks to advance into a narrow defile before triggering massive explosions that had been prepared using naval mines and artillery shells. 3 tanks were destroyed instantly, and the survivors were engaged by multiple anti-tank guns firing from prepared positions. Only aggressive action by supporting infantry and massive artillery support allowed the remaining tanks to withdraw. The incident demonstrated that Japanese forces were still capable of inflicting significant casualties when conditions favored them. But these Japanese successes were tactical victories that could not change the strategic reality. For every American tank destroyed, 2 more could be brought forward from the massive logistics infrastructure supporting the invasion. Tank crews killed or wounded were replaced by trained personnel from replacement depots. Damaged tanks were recovered under fire by tank retriever vehicles and repaired at beach maintenance facilities that operated around the clock. The American industrial and training base meant that losses which would have been crippling to Japanese forces were merely temporary setbacks. By contrast, every Japanese defensive position destroyed, every anti-tank gun knocked out, every experienced gunner killed represented an irreplaceable loss. Japanese forces had no replacements, no ability to make good their casualties. The attrition warfare that American forces could sustain indefinitely was steadily grinding down Japanese defensive capabilities. General Ushijima's staff calculated that at current rates, they could hold the southern defensive lines for perhaps 6 to 8 weeks before combat effectiveness degraded below minimum levels. After that, organized resistance would become impossible. The physical and psychological toll on Japanese defenders was immense. Soldiers who had been confident in their fortifications found themselves trapped in positions that had become death traps. The flame attacks were particularly devastating to morale. Japanese troops began abandoning cave positions after dark, preferring to take their chances in the open rather than face the possibility of being burned alive.
American patrols found evidence of Japanese defensive positions that had been evacuated without a fight, the defenders simply unable to face another day of systematic destruction. American tank crews, meanwhile, were gaining confidence with each successful operation. The early fears that Okinawa's terrain would neutralize their effectiveness had proven unfounded. While the fighting was brutal and casualties were significant, the armored forces were demonstrating decisively that even the strongest defensive positions could be reduced with proper tactics and sufficient firepower. Tank commanders, who had watched helplessly as friends died in the early battles, now felt they had answers, methods that worked, ways to win without suffering unsustainable losses. The transformation was particularly evident among flamethrower tank crews. Initially, many had volunteered for this duty with trepidation, knowing they would be priority targets for Japanese gunners. After weeks of combat, these crews had become an elite within the tank battalions, specialists in the most dangerous but most effective form of assault warfare. They developed techniques for approaching cave positions using terrain and supporting fire to minimize exposure. They learned to identify the ventilation shafts that served cave complexes, directing flame into these openings to fill entire tunnel systems with fire. Their effectiveness became legendary among both American and Japanese forces. By early May, American forces had battered their way through the first defensive line and were approaching the second, even more formidable series of ridges and escarpments. The Shuri Line, named after Shuri Castle which sat at its center, represented Ushijima's
main defensive position. Here, the Japanese had concentrated their heaviest weapons, their most experienced troops, and their most elaborate fortifications. American intelligence estimated that more than 40,000 Japanese troops occupied positions along an 8-mile front. Taking this position would require everything American forces had learned in 6 weeks of brutal combat. The battle for the Shuri Line would become the bloodiest phase of the entire campaign, a grinding match of attrition that would test the endurance of both sides. But by this point, the pattern was established. American armor, working in close cooperation with infantry, engineers, and supporting arms, would systematically destroy each Japanese position regardless of the cost. The tanks that Japanese planners had believed could be stopped through prepared defenses and anti-tank weapons had become an unstoppable force, rolling forward meter by meter, crushing resistance through overwhelming firepower and tactical innovation. The thunder of American guns and the roar of tank engines had become the constant soundtrack of southern Okinawa. In caves and bunkers throughout the defensive lines, Japanese soldiers listened to that approaching thunder and knew that it meant their deaths were coming, as inevitable as the sunrise. The massive American armored formations that General Ushijima's staff had believed could be contained through terrain and fortifications were proving impossible to stop. Each day brought the American tanks closer, their numbers seemingly endless, their firepower devastating, their crews learning and adapting with each engagement. The stage was set for the final phase of the battle, when American armored might would face the strongest defensive positions the Japanese could create. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Okinawa, but would demonstrate once and for all whether fortifications and determination could stand against modern armored warfare. The answer, written in fire and steel across the ridges of southern Okinawa, would reshape military thinking about defensive operations for generations to come. The assault on the Shuri Line began on May 11th with the largest artillery barrage American forces had yet assembled in the Pacific Theater. Over 600 field pieces, ranging from 105mm howitzers to massive 240mm guns, opened fire simultaneously at dawn. For 40 minutes, the southern ridges disappeared under a curtain of explosions as shells rained down at a rate exceeding 1 round per second. Naval vessels offshore added their firepower, with battleships and cruisers hurling 14- and 16-inch shells into suspected Japanese command positions.
The bombardment consumed more ammunition than some entire Pacific campaigns had used, yet commanders knew it would only marginally degrade the Japanese defenses buried deep in their coral fortresses. As the barrage lifted, over 300 Sherman tanks from 6 different battalions began rolling forward in the largest coordinated armor operation yet attempted on Okinawa. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Columns of steel stretched back for miles, engines roaring, tracks churning mud, radio nets crackling with commands and reports. Infantry divisions moved forward alongside the armor, their troops using the tanks as shields against the small arms fire that would inevitably erupt. Infantry engineers rode on the back decks of lead tanks, ready to dismount and clear obstacles or create firing positions. Overhead, Marine Corsairs and Army Thunderbolts circled, waiting for calls to strike identified targets with bombs and napalm. Japanese observers watching from concealed positions throughout the Shuri Heights felt their stomachs tighten as they counted the approaching vehicles. Intelligence reports had warned of American armored strength, but seeing hundreds of tanks moving in coordinated columns was psychologically overwhelming. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, commanding an anti-tank company positioned near Dakeshi Ridge, whispered orders to his gun crews to hold fire until the Americans entered the killing zone his unit had prepared. Nakamura was a veteran of fighting in China and Manchuria, experienced enough to know that panic and premature firing would accomplish nothing. His 47mm guns had perhaps one chance to inflict significant damage before American counterfire would locate and destroy his positions. That one chance had to count. The American advance proceeded cautiously, tank commanders hyper-aware that the easy approach march could explode into violence at any moment. Platoon leaders constantly scanned the ridgelines ahead, looking for the muzzle flash or movement that would reveal enemy positions. In the lead tank of Company B, 711th Tank Battalion, Lieutenant James Harding checked his map coordinates against the terrain features visible through his periscope. His platoon had been assigned to support the 1st Battalion, 381st Infantry Regiment, in an assault on a ridge mass that intelligence had designated Hill 178. The designation was clinical, revealing nothing of the horror that position contained. Japanese engineers had spent 3 months converting Hill 178 into a fortress, with over 40 cave positions, multiple tunnel systems, and pre-positioned ammunition and supplies to sustain a garrison of nearly 800 troops. Taking that single hill would require everything American forces had learned in 6 weeks of brutal combat. The first indication of Japanese resistance came not from the expected direction. As Harding's platoon crossed a small valley and began climbing the lower slopes of Hill 178, explosions had created a new type of defensive obstacle, a command-detonated minefield where explosive charges could be triggered selectively by observers. The lead Sherman in Harding's platoon lurched sideways as its right track was blown off by a buried charge containing over 50 pounds of explosives. The tank slewed to a halt, blocking the narrow path the other vehicles were following.
The stunned crew could react. A second explosion destroyed another tank 20 yards behind, trapping the remaining Shermans between 2 disabled vehicles in a confined space. Captain Nakamura had timed his ambush perfectly. As American tankers attempted to reverse out of the killing zone, his anti-tank guns opened fire from 3 separate positions. Armor-piercing rounds slammed into the Sherman's flanks and rear quarters, the weakest points of their armor protection. One tank exploded in a ball of orange flame as a round penetrated its engine compartment and ignited fuel. Another took 3 hits in rapid succession, each impact sending showers of sparks and metal fragments ricocheting through the interior. The crew bailed out through the hatches, running desperately for cover as Japanese machine gunners opened fire. 2 men went down before reaching the shelter of a bomb crater. The survivors huddled in the muddy depression, listening to the screams of wounded comrades trapped in burning vehicles. Lieutenant Harding barked commands into his radio, calling for smoke shells to screen the trapped platoon from Japanese observers. Within seconds, artillery rounds burst around the disabled tanks, creating a thick, white curtain that obscured Japanese aim. Under this cover, the surviving Shermans backed away from the ambush site, their commanders knowing that staying in place meant certain destruction. Combat engineers moved forward under covering fire from infantry, assessing whether the disabled tanks could be recovered or would have to be destroyed in place to prevent them from blocking the route. The assault on Hill 178 had lasted less than 5 minutes and had already cost 3 tanks destroyed and 2 damaged. The ridge itself remained untouched, its garrison intact and ready for the next American attempt. Similar scenes played out across the entire front as American units discovered that the Shuri Line defenses exceeded even the pessimistic estimates of intelligence officers. Every approach was covered by interlocking fire from multiple positions. Minefields had been laid with diabolical cunning, creating channels that funneled attacking forces into pre-registered kill zones. Japanese artillery, which had been relatively quiet during earlier phases of the battle, now opened up with savage intensity. Shells crashed down on American assembly areas, disrupting attacks before they could fully develop. Counter-battery fire from American artillery would silence Japanese guns temporarily, only to have them resume firing from different positions after being moved through the tunnel systems. The weather conspired to make conditions even worse. Spring rains, which had been intermittent in April, became constant downpours in May. The already muddy ground turned into a quagmire that swallowed vehicles and men alike. Tanks bogged down in mud so deep that their tracks spun uselessly, unable to gain traction. Recovery vehicles sent to extract disabled tanks became stuck themselves, creating surreal scenes of half-buried armor scattered across the landscape. Infantry slogged through knee-deep muck, exhausted before they ever reached Japanese positions. The rain filled shell craters and turned valleys into shallow lakes, eliminating routes that tanks had used just days before. American commanders faced the grim reality that frontal assaults against the Shuri Line were producing unsustainable casualties with minimal gains. In 5 days of intensive combat, American forces had advanced less than half a mile in most sectors. Tank losses exceeded 50 vehicles, with many more damaged and awaiting repair. Infantry casualties approached 5,000 killed and wounded. The Japanese defensive system, rather than crumbling under sustained pressure, seemed to grow stronger as American forces became disorganized and exhausted.
Support. The objective would not be to systematically reduce each defensive position, but to smash through the Japanese lines so rapidly that defenders would be unable to shift forces to meet the threat. Once through the main defensive belt, American armor would rampage through rear areas, destroying command posts, supply dumps, and artillery positions. Infantry would follow the armor breakthrough, expanding the penetration and preventing Japanese forces from sealing the gap. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. Concentrating so much armor in such a confined space violated every principle of dispersion that had been drilled into tank commanders. If Japanese defenses held, the resulting traffic jam could turn into a catastrophic massacre. But Withers argued convincingly that half measures had failed. The only way to crack the Shuri Line was overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. General Buckner, recognizing that conventional approaches were failing, approved the plan. The assault would take place on May 21st, allowing 10 days to concentrate forces and prepare the breakthrough operation. The preparation was unprecedented in its scale and complexity. Over 230 tanks were assembled in concealed positions behind the front lines, representing nearly every operational armored vehicle in the 10th Army. These included standard M4A3 Shermans armed with 75mm guns, up-gun variants with 76mm high-velocity cannons, heavily armored jumbo assault tanks, and 24 flamethrower tanks that would lead the assault. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to ensure every vehicle was mechanically perfect. Ammunition was stockpiled until each tank carried maximum loads. Fuel trucks stood ready to top off tanks immediately before the attack. Every crew received detailed briefings on the plan, studied terrain models, and rehearsed their roles until actions became automatic. artillery preparation reached new levels of sophistication. Fire support coordinators identified over 300 Japanese positions through a combination of aerial photography, ground observation, and analysis of previous engagements. These targets were assigned to specific artillery batteries, ensuring that no position would escape attention. The bombardment plan called for a rolling barrage that would advance ahead of the tanks, suppressing Japanese positions seconds before armor reached them. Counter-battery radars would track any Japanese artillery that fired, bringing immediate retaliation. Naval gunfire would target positions too heavily fortified for field artillery to damage. Aircraft would orbit overhead with napalm and bombs ready to strike within minutes of receiving requests. Infantry assignments were carefully coordinated with the armor. 7 infantry battalions would advance with the tanks, their troops riding on the vehicles or moving on foot immediately behind. Combat engineers would accompany the lead elements, prepared to clear obstacles or create routes under fire. Medical teams established aid stations along the planned axis of advance, positioned to receive casualties without interfering with the attack. Even logistical details received extraordinary attention. Supply trucks were organized into convoys that would follow the assault, carrying ammunition, fuel, and spare parts to sustain the offensive once it punched through Japanese lines. Japanese intelligence detected the American buildup but misinterpreted its significance. Observers reported large tank concentrations but assumed they indicated preparations for attacks across multiple sectors. General Ushijima's staff concluded that Americans were massing reserves to replace units exhausted by previous fighting. The possibility that Americans would concentrate such overwhelming force on a single narrow front seemed tactically unsound, violating the principles of dispersion and mutual support that characterized American doctrine. Japanese defensive plans remained unchanged, with forces distributed relatively evenly across the Shuri line to meet attacks wherever they developed. The attack commenced at precisely 06 on May 21st. Artillery fire erupted along a front stretching from Yonabaru on the east coast to the town of Naha in the west, creating the impression of a general offensive across the entire line. But the real bombardment concentrated on a sector barely 3,000 yards wide, centered on Shuri Castle itself. For 30 minutes, this narrow frontage received more explosive tonnage than had been dropped on some entire cities during the war. The earth itself seemed to shake as thousands of shells slammed into Japanese positions. Coral rocks shattered, cave entrances collapsed, communication wires were severed, and defenders huddled in their deepest shelters, praying they would survive. At 06:30, the artillery shifted to a rolling barrage, and the tanks began moving. The sight defied belief. Over 200 Shermans advanced in waves, their formation resembling a massive steel wedge aimed directly at the heart of Japanese defenses. The lead wave consisted entirely of flamethrower and assault tanks, vehicles chosen for maximum armor protection and devastating close-range firepower. Behind them came waves of gun tanks, their 75 and 76 millimeter cannons ready to engage any target that revealed itself. The coordination was magnificent. Tanks maintained precise intervals, avoiding bunching that would make them vulnerable to artillery while staying close enough to provide mutual support. Company and platoon commanders controlled their units through radio networks that had been carefully tested and rehearsed. Japanese defenders, stunned by the bombardment and confused by diversionary attacks elsewhere, were slow to react to the magnitude of the assault developing. By the time observers realized that hundreds of American tanks were concentrating on a single sector, the lead elements were already overrunning forward positions. Anti-tank guns that attempted to engage were immediately swamped by return fire from multiple Shermans. Japanese gunners discovered that shooting at one tank simply drew fire from a dozen others, all converging on the revealed position. Crews who managed to fire a few rounds before being killed had the satisfaction of seeing their shots bounce harmlessly off the heavy frontal armor of jumbo assault tanks.
Tanks, or strike at angles where even successful penetrations caused minimal damage. The flamethrower tanks went to work with systematic brutality. Every cave mouth, every bunker entrance, every suspected fighting position received streams of burning napalm. Japanese troops who emerged to engage the attackers were cut down by machine gun fire from supporting infantry or crushed beneath tank treads. Those who remained in positions, hoping to survive, found themselves burned alive as flames consumed the oxygen in their shelters and toxic smoke filled every chamber. Within 15 minutes, the first line of Japanese defenses had been shattered. Tanks continued rolling forward, crushing barbed wire obstacles, pushing through rubble, and grinding over trenches that collapsed under their weight. The breakthrough achieved what Withers had predicted. Japanese defensive coordination collapsed as command and control systems were severed. Units that might have shifted to reinforce threatened sectors found their routes blocked by American tanks that had penetrated deep into rear areas. Artillery positions that had dominated American advances for weeks were overrun before crews could displace their guns. Supply dumps that had sustained Japanese garrisons exploded in massive fireballs as tank fire ignited ammunition stockpiles. The carefully integrated defensive system that had frustrated American attacks for 6 weeks disintegrated in less than an hour. Japanese resistance, though disorganized, remained fierce in scattered locations. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe, commanding an anti-tank platoon near Shuri Castle, rallied survivors from several units and established a hasty defensive line across the path of the American advance. Watanabe's position included 2 47mm guns, a 70mm battalion gun, and approximately 50 infantry armed with rifles and magnetic mines. As American tanks approached his position, Watanabe held fire until they closed to less than 200 yards, then ordered his guns to fire simultaneously. 3 Shermans were hit, 2 disabled, and 1 destroyed. But the return fire was apocalyptic. Every American tank that could see Watanabe's position opened fire, joined by infantry weapons and supporting artillery. Within seconds, Watanabe's defensive line was obliterated, its personnel dead or dying, its weapons smashed. Such desperate stands occurred throughout the breakthrough sector, but they were tactical anomalies that could not alter the strategic reality. By noon on May 21st, American armor had advanced over 2 miles, penetrating completely through the main Shuri defensive belt. Japanese forces in sectors adjacent to the breakthrough found themselves cut off, their supply routes severed, their communications destroyed. General Ushijima, receiving fragmentary and contradictory reports in his underground headquarters, initially refused to believe that American forces had achieved such a decisive penetration. When the truth became undeniable, he ordered a general withdrawal to secondary defensive positions further south, hoping to establish a new line before American forces could exploit their success. The withdrawal order came too late for thousands of Japanese troops. American tanks, now operating in relatively open terrain behind the main defensive positions, hunted Japanese units attempting to disengage and retreat. Tank commanders called in artillery fire on columns of retreating soldiers, directed airstrikes against vehicle convoys, and engaged any concentration of troops with devastating direct fire. Japanese units that had maintained cohesion during weeks of defensive fighting disintegrated during the chaos of withdrawal. Soldiers abandoned heavy equipment, discarded weapons to move faster, and desperately sought any route southward that might offer escape from the pursuing American armor. The human cost of the breakthrough and subsequent pursuit was staggering. American forces estimated that over 8,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the first 24 hours of the offensive, with thousands more wounded or captured. Entire battalions simply ceased to exist as organized units. The legendary Japanese discipline that had sustained resistance for so long finally cracked under the psychological shock of seeing their strongest defenses crushed in a single morning. For the first time in the Okinawa campaign, American forces encountered Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender in significant numbers, though many were shot by their own officers or killed themselves rather than face the shame of capture. American casualties, while still significant, were remarkably light considering the scale of the operation. Tank losses totaled 19 vehicles destroyed and 37 damaged, far below what pessimistic estimates had projected. Infantry casualties were approximately 1,200 killed and wounded, brutal numbers by any measure, but sustainable given the magnitude of success achieved. Most critically, the breakthrough had not simply pushed Japanese forces back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.